everybody, and welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology. So we've been talking about homeostasis. The word homeostasis suggests something is staying the same. Nothing actually stays exactly the same. There's always some fluctuation up and down, and I call that a fluctuation between narrow limits. So it's going up and down a little, it's not going up and down a lot. The features that are held within narrow limits, like blood pressure, body temperature, etc., could be called homeostatic constants. And then I also went over that phrase, the constancy of the internal environment. And what is the internal environment? It's the tissue fluid. Then, as a specific example for homeostatic regulation, I selected the pancreas regulating the blood glucose level, the blood sugar level. And I already told you, whenever we see something is being regulated, it implies that there'd be a problem if you had too much or too little of whatever's being regulated, or there'd be a problem with something going too fast or too slow. And I explained for glucose why it's bad to have a high blood glucose or a very low blood glucose level. So if you ate a carbohydrate-rich meal, which usually would mean a lot of starch, and starch is a necklace-like molecule made out of beads called glucose, you break that necklace up, you digest it into the individual beads that are glucose molecules. Those are small enough to get absorbed into the blood. So roughly 45 minutes to an hour and a half after you've eaten a carbohydrate-rich meal, your blood glucose is going to be on the high side. Now, in this context, I don't mean abnormally high. I mean on the high side of that fluctuation. We don't want it to get too high. We don't want it to get abnormally high. So the pancreas is always keeping track of the blood glucose level, and when it sees that the blood glucose is too high, it starts to secrete a hormone called insulin. The insulin tells the liver to store the glucose. Since the liver is taking the glucose out of the blood glucose level falls, and it falls until it's too low. The pancreas is still keeping track. It now sees that the blood glucose level is too low. It stops secreting the insulin. So the liver stops removing glucose from the blood, but the other cells and tissues in the body, many of them, would continue to use glucose for energy. So if the only thing that we did would be to stop secreting the insulin, it would help, but it wouldn't solve the problem, because the blood glucose level would continue to fall as certain other tissues continue to burn glucose for energy. So the pancreas is going to secrete a second hormone called glucagon, which carries the opposite message of insulin. The message of insulin tells the liver to store glucose. The message of glucagon tells the liver stops to release the glucose back into the blood. So the glucagon tells the liver to release the glucose. Do not erase. Who wrote that? Do not erase. I can erase. Okay. The glucagon tells the liver to release the glucose. The glucose is going back into the blood, so the blood glucose rises until the blood glucose level is slightly high. The pancreas is continuously keeping track, so now the pancreas sees the blood glucose is too high. It'll start to secrete insulin, but it has to stop secreting the glucagon, because if it secretes both at the same time, it's like stepping on the gas and the brake at the same time, which is not efficient. Because the two hormones have opposite messages, we only want to be secreting one at a time. So when we start secreting the insulin, we stop secreting the glucagon. Here, when we started to secrete the glucagon, we stop secreting the insulin. So we went around this loop in the last video. This was a fill in the blank. I asked you to take a moment and fill it in before I gave you the answer. Hopefully everyone was able to figure out the correct answer. If you couldn't figure it out at the time, the more important question right now would be, now that I've told you that the answer is stop secreting glucagon, then the question is, does that make sense to you? If that does make sense to you, you probably understand the diagram. If it does not make sense to you, then you probably don't understand the diagram. So hopefully you understand this diagram. I pointed out that in order for this to continue, you have to be eating regularly, taking in carbohydrate regularly. Otherwise, at some point, you'd run out of glucose and the whole thing would stop. I also want to point out, without making a big deal about it, that in addition to the pancreas keeping track of the blood glucose level, there's a part of your brain that's called the hypothalamus. Thalamus, part of your brain, which is also keeping track of the blood glucose level. And when that part of your brain detects a low blood glucose, it triggers feelings of hunger, so that at that point you go out and eat and presumably take in some carbohydrates. So that's also part of the story of blood glucose regulation, but I'm not going to spend time on that. We're focusing on how it works with the pancreas. Okay, so on your outline, after the initial introduction to homeostasis, I said I would talk about negative feedback loops. This is an example of a negative feedback loop. Let's see how well this works. Okay, so you can ignore for now everything below that line. Why is this a negative feedback loop? I go through this backwards. It's a loop because it keeps going around and around and around. Now, usually you think of a loop as being the shape of a circle, and here the shape is a rectangle, but even though it's shaped like a rectangle, we're still calling it a loop because a loop goes around and around and around. Why is it feedback? Feedback means information. If one person asks another person, let's say it's a male asks a female, because I happen to be a male, and before I got married, and I got married about 10 minutes before the Big Bang. Before I got married, I would occasionally, as much as I could, I would date, and I might ask a woman if she wanted to go out. So if a man asks a woman if she wants to go out on Friday night, and she says, no, thank you, I don't want to go out with you on Friday night, I have to wash my hair, and you can bet that if you ever ask me out again, I will also have to wash my hair. So please don't ask, and it'd be nice if I could never see you again, as it is. She's giving the man feedback. She's giving him information. Now, in that case, it's negative feedback, because what makes it negative is that it works against the initial condition or the initial stimulus. A stimulus causes a response. If I shine a light in your eye, you'll probably blink. The opening of the eye that allows light to come in is called the pupil, and the pupil will constrict. It'll become more narrow to limit how much light is coming into the eye. So the stimulus would be the light, the response would be the constriction of the pupil. If you touch a hot object, you'll jerk your hand away. The heat is the stimulus. The response is jerking your hand away. So in the example I gave, if somebody asks somebody else out, that is the stimulus. Will you go out with me? And if the response is no, I won't, that's negative. It inhibits or opposes the possibility of the person asking again if that other person will go out with them. So that's negative feedback. And how does that apply to this? So in just giving you this general description, and if you need to hear that again, play it again before you go on to the next part. In that general description of what negative feedback means, I said that there's going to be some initial stimulus, or what I prefer to call an initial condition. So on the test, when we have exam 1, I don't know if I'm going to call it the initial condition or the initial stimulus. I'll try to call it the initial condition, but I may forget. So it's the same thing. You call it the initial condition or the initial stimulus. In this case, let's call it the initial condition. It's going to cause a response, and I'll go over this specifically on the board in a moment. That initial condition, now the way I did it on the board, the initial condition was a high blood glucose level. It's going to lead to a series of responses that ultimately lower the blood glucose level. So the response opposes the initial condition. The initial condition was a high blood glucose. The response was to make it go down. That's opposing or working against the initial condition. So let's go over that in this diagram. Now, because it's a loop, and this may seem complicated, and it is a little complicated, but it's not that complicated. So if you're a little discouraged in terms of feeling you may not be understanding it based on what I just said, then just set that aside and start paying attention again, and it should end up making sense to you. I'm explaining why this is a negative feedback loop. It's a loop because it keeps going around. It's feedback because it involves information. Now, there's at least 2 forms of information in the diagram. One piece of information is how high or low the blood glucose level is. And the pancreas is getting that information by keeping track of how high or how low the blood glucose is. Now, depending on how much glucose is in the blood, the pancreas is going to send information to the liver. And it's going to tell the liver either to store the glucose or to release the glucose. Now, in what form is the information going to be sent from the pancreas to the liver? Everyone that's watching this video should know the answer to this question at this point. What form does that communication, does that transfer of information take as it's been described in this diagram? And the answer is it takes the form of a hormone, either insulin or glucagon. So it's a loop because it keeps going around. There's information that we call feedback, information about the glucose level, information about should the liver store glucose or should it release glucose. Now, what makes it negative? Because it's a loop, there's really, once I finish telling the whole story, there's no beginning and end. It's a loop that keeps going around and around. Now, when I told the story, I had to pick a place to start. And I always pick the same place to start, which is you've eaten a carbohydrate-rich meal, and now you have a high blood glucose level. So as I told the story, the initial condition was a high blood glucose level. But I could have started anywhere, and in a few minutes I'll start someplace else in the diagram just to show you what I mean. But for now, I'm going to call this high blood glucose level the initial condition. To find out, is it a negative feedback loop or is it a positive feedback loop? And since I haven't yet explained what a positive feedback loop is, don't concern yourself with that. We're just finding out, is it a negative feedback loop? What makes it a negative feedback loop is that the response opposes or works against the initial condition. So let's start with that idea. What makes it negative is that the response opposes or works against the initial condition. Now, the next part is the part that's a little tricky. And it's because you could say that everything that comes after that condition of a high blood glucose, everything that comes after it is a response. So I say I have an initial condition of a high blood glucose level. The first response is that the pancreas starts to secrete insulin. The second response is that the insulin tells the liver to store glucose, and then the third response is that the blood glucose level falls. So there's 1, 2, 3 responses to this initial condition. The way you determine if it's a negative feedback loop is you have to find the response which is expressed in the same terms as the initial condition. You have to find the response that is expressed in the same terms as the initial condition. Now, what are the terms of the initial condition? The terms are something about the blood glucose level. Specifically, it's high. So the terms are about a high blood glucose level. So there's 3 responses. You have to find the response that is in the same terms as the initial condition. So the first response is that the pancreas starts to secrete insulin. That is a response, but it is not in the same terms. It's not saying anything. To secreting insulin itself doesn't have the phrase blood glucose level. So that is not in the same terms as that. And then it says that the insulin tells the liver to store glucose. That is another response, but there's nothing in this little block of words that says blood glucose level. Now we come to this third response, and this is in the same terms as the initial condition because it's about the blood glucose level. And what's happening to the blood glucose level? It's falling. And that's why it's negative, because a falling blood glucose level opposes or works against the initial condition. The initial condition is that the glucose level is high. Here it's going down. Going down is the opposite of being high. So that's what makes it negative. If the effect of insulin was the opposite of what it actually is, if the effect of insulin was to tell the liver, release the glucose back into the blood, then at this point the blood glucose level would be even higher. So you'd start with an initial condition of a high glucose level, and then the response would make it get even higher. Something like that is going to be called a positive feedback loop, and I'll give an example of that probably in the next video. But this is not going up, this is going down, so it's negative. Now, again, because it's a loop, I could pick anywhere and call it the initial condition. So if I picked a low blood glucose level, and I say, let's start there. you have to find the first response that is about the glucose level. So the first response to a low blood glucose level is that the pancreas starts to secrete glucagon. It stops secreting insulin, it starts secreting glucagon. That is a response to a low blood glucose level. But it's not in the same terms because there's nowhere in this statement of stopping the secretion of insulin or starting the secretion of glucagon, there's nothing in here that specifically says blood glucose level. Then we have this next response where the glucagon tells the liver to release glucose. In that group of words, it doesn't say anything about blood glucose level. So that response is also not in the same terms as the initial condition. But here it says blood glucose rises. Because this is about the blood glucose, it is the same terms. Blood glucose, blood glucose. Here it was low, here it rises, it goes up. If you start with something being low, and the response is that it goes up, going up opposes what I wrote over there. It opposes or works against, going up works against the initial condition of being low. Now, here the response was that the blood glucose level goes down. And at that point, it would have made sense for me to say that the response decreases the initial condition. Here it was high, the response made it fall, which is it decreased. And because we might associate negative with the idea of something decreasing, it might make sense to say, it's not going to make sense, don't misunderstand. But at first you might think, well, I guess negative means it's going to decrease. That's only true half the time, and that's why I don't say negative feedback means something decreases. I don't say it because it's only correct half the time. So on this side of the top half of the loop, that would work. You start with a high blood glucose level, it ends up decreasing. So there it works, but here on the bottom half, you start with a low blood glucose level and then it goes up, it rises. Rising is not decreasing, it's increasing. So I purposely avoid using the terms increase or decrease. And I say opposes or works against because that works every time. Now, one more example from this same diagram. Instead of looking at the glucose level, I could look at the hormone secretion. So if I say starting to secrete insulin, if I say starting the secretion of insulin, if I call that the initial condition, it's still going to be a negative feedback loop. Now, turn the video off in a moment and think about this and see if you can find the answer on your own. When I say that the pancreas starts to secrete insulin, and starting to secrete the insulin is the initial condition, that's a response, that's a response, that's a response, that's a response, that's a response. Everything in a way is a response to starting to secrete the insulin. Go around clockwise and you have to find the first response that is in the same terms as the initial condition. So the initial condition has to do with the terms relate to the secretion of insulin. Specifically, we start to secrete insulin. So you have to keep going until you find something that says something specific about insulin secretion. So pause the video and see if you can figure out what response do we come to that is saying something specific about insulin. Pause. All right, so presumably you paused it, you thought about this for a few minutes, or you're just rushing through the whole thing. Now, you may have such a busy life that you got no choice but to rush through the whole thing, and then you just got to do the best you can. But if you're spending more than an hour a day on Facebook or Instabook or Twitter or whatever the hell you call it, or if you're spending more than an hour a day watching TV, take the hour and relax. Everybody needs to relax. But if you're spending more than an hour a day on social media or watching television, that's where you have time to be spending on this type of stuff, and that can have a beneficial impact possibly on the whole rest of your life. So it's up to you to decide how important this is, and if you feel it is important to do well in the course, you must find the time. It's very unlikely, it's not impossible. If you're very, very talented, you can do well quickly without spending that much time on it. But for most people, this is going to take a lot of time. So hopefully you took the time to think, well, if the teacher is calling this the initial condition, starting to secrete insulin, what is the first response I come to that relates to insulin secretion? So I start to secrete insulin. The insulin tells the liver to store glucose. So the liver storing the glucose is a response to the secretion of insulin, but it is not in the same terms as secretion of insulin. Then the blood glucose level falling is also a response to the secretion of insulin, but it's not in the terms of insulin secretion. The blood glucose level is now too low, another response to the secretion of insulin, but again, not in the same terms. Here it says stop secreting insulin. So that is in the same terms as the initial condition. We started to secrete insulin, so the terms relate to the secretion of insulin. And here we stop secreting the insulin. If the initial condition is starting something, then the response is stopping it, it should be obvious that stopping something is opposing starting it. Now that's as many examples as I'm going to take from this diagram to try to illustrate why we're calling it a negative feedback loop. But if you want to go one step further, could you figure out if I say starting to secrete glucagon is the initial condition, then what is the response in the same terms? And so I lied a moment ago when I said looking at insulin secretion would be the last example. I'll use this as one final example, and again I'm going to say, what am I going to say? I'm going to say, I never know what I'm going to say ahead of time. It's not until I get to the end of the sentence that I actually know what I'm going to say. And this is true for you as well. Throughout the day, you're starting these sentences that you're saying to other people or starting sentences that you're writing. And I suggest that when you start those sentences, you don't know what the end of the sentence is going to be, which is a little scary when you think about it. So if I say that starting to secrete glucagon is the initial condition, what is the first response, which is in the same terms as insulin, as glucagon secretion? Pause the video. Come up with the answer on your own. So if we start to secrete glucagon, we call that the initial condition. This is the first response. The liver releases glucose. The second response, the blood glucose rises. The third response, the blood glucose is too high. The fourth response, the pancreas stops secreting glucagon. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4 responses. This is the first response where we're actually saying something specific about the secretion of glucagon. Here we started, here we stopped. Stopping opposes starting. And that's what makes it a negative feedback loop. See you in a little bit.